Ulithi, Federated States of Micronesia, 1st of October, 1944. Dark water filled the vast lagoon as tankers drifted to station. Fast carriers arrived low on fuel and time. If refueling failed here, the Philippine campaign slowed or stopped. Ulithi Atoll, ring-shaped coral island, sat empty but ideal. The lagoon was broad, sheltered, and far from enemy airfields. The Navy needed a forward fuel base and needed it fast. There were no docks, cranes, or pipelines. Service Squadron 10, Mobile Logistics Fleet Command, built a port from ships and steel. Fleet oilers, fuel tankers built for warships, moored in rows and held position. Pontoon piers, modular steel floats used as docks, gave workboats a place to tie up. Hoses ran across the water to carriers, destroyers, and gasoline barges. Within weeks, Ulithi became the busiest anchorage in the world. The fast carriers sailed on schedule toward the Philippines, and the fuel kept up. This is how Service Squadron 10 built a floating fuel base and kept it running. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands, 23rd of September, 1944. Scouts slipped across a quiet lagoon and found no enemy guns. By nightfall, Marines held the islets without a shot. The next move would decide how fast the Pacific War could advance. Ulithi Atoll, ring-shaped coral reef enclosing a lagoon, solved a hard problem of distance. The Philippines lay about 1,300 miles away, roughly 2,100 kilometers. That gap mattered more than maps suggested. Fast carrier groups burned fuel at a high rate. If they had to sail back to rear bases for every refill, operations slowed to a crawl. The basin at Ulithi spanned over 200 square miles, more than 500 square kilometers. It was deep and sheltered over much of its floor. Several passes cut through the reef and allowed large ships to enter. Hundreds of hulls could anchor without crowding. Dispersed anchoring reduced risk from air attack and accidents. It also eased traffic, which often caused delays in tight harbors. Service Squadron 10, Mobile Fleet Support Unit, answered the distance problem. Commodore Worrell R. Carter led it with clear priorities. Fuel delivery came first. Speed of turnaround for warships came next. Permanent shore works came last. The squadron chose floating storage over shore tanks. That choice saved months of construction and cut exposure to bomb damage on land. The idea was not new by Ulithi. Earlier in 1944, the fleet tried a floating port at Majuro. Oilers, naval fuel tankers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels tied to buoys and served combat ships from their own decks. It worked. Crews learned to rig hoses fast, control small craft traffic, and schedule arrivals to avoid idle time. Majuro proved the concept could scale. Work at Eniwetok refined the routines. Carter's staff built standard mooring plans, issued fueling checklists, and set time goals for every task. Tenders and repair ships staged parts and tools close to the work. Pumps, hoses, and couplings were kept rigged, tested, and ready. Crews practiced both anchored refueling and at-sea transfers. Each drill shaved minutes from every evolution, which added up across a fleet. Oilers changed the tempo of carrier war. A carrier group could meet oilers at sea, refuel on the move, and keep its patrols on schedule. Destroyers set the pace of these cycles. Their small tanks and high speed meant frequent replenishment. A destroyer that screened carriers at 25 knots could run low in a day. The oilers kept them in the fight without a long trip to a distant harbor. Ulithi's scale supported this system. The lagoon let the squadron spread ships by type and risk. Ammunition ships sat well apart. Oilers formed lines near deep water lanes to speed arrivals and departures. Repair ships anchored where swells were light. The wide spacing reduced fire risk and eased navigation. If one area took damage, the rest could keep working. Seabees construction battalions brought the hardware to make it real. They assembled steel pontoons, modular floating boxes, into piers and causeways. They built barges for gasoline, lighters for cargo, and platforms for cranes. They set heavy anchors and buoys to form fleet moorings. They turned piles of prefabricated parts into usable waterfront in days rather than months. Their speed matched Carter's priorities. Floating storage had clear advantages. Shore tanks were large targets and required concrete pipes and pumps. They also needed land rights, surveys, and dredging. An oiler, by contrast, arrived full and ready to pump. If threatened, it could move. If hit, it did not take an entire tank farm with it. Tankers in rows, plus smaller barges, gave the same capacity with less fixed risk. By late September, the logic pointed to Ulithi. It sat close enough to the future battles to keep cycles short. It was far enough from enemy airfields to lower daily risk. Its lagoon held the numbers required by a modern fleet. Carter now had a place to apply the lessons from Majuro and Eniwetok on a larger scale. The squadron began to stage assets even as survey boats sounded channels. Oilers plotted mooring spots. Repair ships prepared work lists for the first wave of damaged hulls. Tug captains planned how to move barges and pontoon sections around the ring of islets. The parts of a floating port were on the move, and the anchorage could take them. Ulithi did not add one fixed base. It linked ships into a system. That system could absorb a surge of arrivals, feed and fix them, and send them back out fast. The choice to build on water, not on land, matched the war's pace. The fuel would flow in the open lagoon, and with it, the campaign's schedule would hold. The first fuel ships came in under blackout on the 1st of October, 1944. Signal lamps blinked from low hills and quiet boats, each beam hooded and narrow. The carriers to the east needed fuel soon, and the lagoon had to work now. This is how an empty anchorage became a floating fuel base in days. The arrivals moved in echelons, staggered arrival groups, set by a strict plan. Oilers led, repair ships followed, and store ships trailed close behind. Port director teams, anchorage traffic controller, boarded a small headquarters ship and took charge of lanes and anchorages. They used updated charts, plotted bearings by the minute, and kept radio talk short and clear. Seabees construction battalions landed on the small islets at first light. Survey parties walked reef edges and marked safe landing spots for gear. Hydrographic boats, survey craft that measures depth, ran lines across the lagoon and checked soundings against old charts. The first corrections went to the port director within hours, not days. Workboats towed pontoon sections, modular steel float, from cargo holds and rafted them into piers. Crews pinned joints with steel bars and braced them with timbers. Deck cranes lifted fuel hose reels and small pumps onto new barge platforms. By afternoon, the first short pier took shape near deep water where tankers could lie close. Mooring buoys, anchored float used for securing ships, went down on fresh-laid ground tackle. Heavy anchors and chain lengths came off barges and over the side in a steady beat. Tugs set each buoy by compass, then pulled hard to prove the hold. The spreads were built to take a loaded oiler without dragging in a squall. Signal stations raised short masts on two islets that flanked the main approach. Approach lights stayed shielded under blackout rules, and operators used prearranged flashes. Radar on patrol craft watched the lanes for stray hulls that might show bright when lights stayed dark. The system guided ships in without breaking silence. Patrol craft guarded every pass through the reef day and night. They circled at low speed, checked hull numbers, and challenged with light signals. Submarine scare stories were common in forward anchorages, even when none came near. The watch stayed tight anyway, because oil and ammunition made inviting targets. Fuel barges spread out across the lagoon to limit fire risk. Each barge had its own safety zone, with a boom and a slow no-wake rule for nearby boats. Ammunition ships anchored on the far side of the field, with clear water between them and any fuel pier. The distances looked wasteful on a map, but paid for themselves in safety. Hydrographic teams marked fueling stations only where depth and swing room matched the largest hulls. They set range markers on islets to help ships line up and hold steady. The port director published a first-day plan that tied arrival times to tide and light. It left no gaps large enough for drifting or delay. By the second dawn, hose teams drilled on the pontoons. They flaked hoses in long runs, checked couplings for leaks, and tagged each length by size. Fire parties stood by with foam and water, and a salvage tug sat at idle nearby with a pump ready. Everyone knew the first real transfer would be watched as a test. The first carriers turned in from the open sea as the tide rose. Tugs met them outside the reef and led them past the signal stations at slow speed. Destroyers peeled off and went to the nearest oilers that were already moored. The carriers kept way on and took anchorages set the day before. Fueling started at once. Tanker pumps pushed steady pressure, and deck teams took strains on lines without wasted motion. The carriers lifted the first hoses aboard and reported pressure within minutes. Strip charts from the pumps recorded every gallon and confirmed flow without interruption. Repair ships already had lists of urgent jobs. They sent welding teams to patch flight deck divots and turbine fitters to chase leaks. Store ships issued canned food, fresh water, and engine oils in a tight queue. Nothing bumped fueling off the schedule, because fuel set the tempo for all else. Signal stations shifted to a dimmer pattern at dusk, then went dark on the hour set by the plan. Patrol craft tightened their circles near the passes and kept engines warm. Only the faint thrum of pumps carried across the water, steady as a clock. The lagoon stayed quiet to anyone outside it. Within days, the process felt routine. Oilers came and went on time, and the lanes did not clog. The first carriers took fuel at anchor without delay and cleared out on schedule. The floating gas stations worked, and the fleet could plan the next strikes with confidence. By mid-October at Ulithi, hoses arced across the water like taut ropes. Fuel oil-fed boilers, diesel-powered auxiliaries, and aviation gasoline, High-octane fuel for piston aircraft served planes. If any stream failed or got contaminated, sorties fell and ships slowed. The lagoon's storage sat in steel hulls. Tanker hulls and barges provided all storage, not shore tanks. That choice kept supply mobile and cut time to first issue. It also spread risk over many ships rather than one land tank farm. The system depended on steady pumps, clean fuel, and fast connections under watch. Fuel moved from manifold valve assembly that directs flow to manifold by plan. Heavy fuel oil stayed hot in warming coils so pumps could push it. Diesel moved at ambient temperature, with strainers catching grit before it reached receivers. Aviation gasoline ran in separate circuits and never mixed with other grades. High-capacity pumps pushed fuel through long, flexible hoses at sustained pressure. Standard hose diameters and couplings sped hookups across ship types. 6-inch lines carried boiler fuel. Smaller lines served diesel and gasoline. Crews kept spare lengths and gaskets stacked near every station. They practiced swapping parts without delay. The hookup dance looked simple because teams drilled it. A workboat brought the hose end to a destroyer's deck. Deckhands caught a heaving line, hauled in the messenger, and lifted the hose to the kingpost. A gasket went between flanges, coupling bolts drew tight, and a safety chain took strain. Electrical bonding, connecting metal parts to equalize static, clipped on before any valve turned. Practice drills cut connection times and reduced idle pump hours. A trained team latched a 6-inch line in minutes, not half an hour. That saved daylight and freed pumps for the next hull. Quality checks came before flow, not after. Tanker chemists pulled samples with a thief can and sent them to a small bench lab. A hydrometer device that measures liquid density confirmed grade, and a centrifuge spun out water and sediment. Temperature entered every line because warm fuel expanded in the tank. Aviation gasoline drew extra caution. Crews checked clarity in glass jars and verified no trace of water. Test results rode back by small boat before any receiver saw pressure on a gauge. Only then did the pump engineer crack the valve. Safety sat in layers and started with distance. Gasoline barges were anchored far from crowded anchorages and downwind of main ship lines. They lay in clear water with extra anchor scope and wide safety arcs marked on charts. Fire boats stood by with foam and water monitors, deck-mounted water cannons during every transfer. A tug with a salvage pump loitered close enough to reach a spill fast. Each hose station rigged fire hoses, foam concentrate, and portable extinguishers. Signals for emergency shutdown were agreed before the first bolt went on a flange. Those measures stayed the same, day or night. No-spark rules covered every transfer without exception. Radios that threw sparks stayed off near gasoline lines. Signal flags and hand lamps took their place. Lights stayed shielded, and only explosion-proof fixtures got near open manifolds. Non-sparking tools, bronze hand tools that do not spark, replaced steel wrenches at gasoline stations. Clothing rules barred hobnail boots and silk or wool near avgas because static clung to fibers. Crews wet down decks and sprayed hoses during dry, windy spells. Some teams carried an explosimeter portable meter for flammable vapor levels to check air near vents. Static risk never went to zero, so bonding wires stayed clipped until the last drop. Watch teams patrolled for leaks, sheen, and static hazards from the first minute to the last. A boat circled the receiver and watched the sea skin for thin rainbows. Deck watches kept eyes on gasket seams and valve glands. Any sheen drew an instant slowdown or stop, a rag and pan for drips, and a call to the tug with the pump. Logs took more than gallons. Transfer logs recorded volumes, times, and temperatures for each issue. Tally sheets also noted hose size, pump used, and any stoppage. Corrected volumes went to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15.6 degrees Celsius, to match standard tables. Paperwork moved as fast as fuel. Small craft shuttled samples and paperwork to keep lines moving. A motor launch ran a steady triangle from tanker to receiver to port office. It carried test slips, delivery tickets, and routing orders for the next ship in line. That flow cleared disputes before they started. It also told planners when a pump would free up or a hose would be ready for another job. The aim was simple: keep pumps turning and keep ships on time. Every saved minute added to the fleet's reach. What did these routines buy the fleet? Time and predictability. A destroyer topped off in a few hours and returned to screen a carrier. A carrier took longer, often through a night, but got out on schedule. Tankers shifted moorings with their last hoses coiled and their logs squared. The process repeated without surprise because people set it up that way. Procedures made a floating gas station reliable. With clean fuel in tanks and fires prevented by habit, the lagoon kept its promise and fed the next operation. Pre-dawn swells lifted the oilers off Ulithi's moorings as crews coiled hoses. Their tanks were full and their orders were short. If the first rendezvous slipped, the carrier's strike plan slipped with it. This loop from lagoon to sea and back would keep the clock. Underway replenishment, refueling while ships steered parallel courses, made that loop work. The oiler and receiver steadied on the same course and speed, often near 12 knots. Lines went over first, then fuel hoses, and pressure came up when both ships held station. The carriers kept their fighters grounded while fuel moved, because safety and steering demanded calm decks. Windows for UNREP rested on three things: weather, sea state, and air tasking, planned flight operations, and strike schedules. A long swell could snap a hose or throw spray across open manifolds. A strike launch could not wait for a pump rate, so planners bent the fueling plan around flights. When a front moved in, the rendezvous slid on the chart to find better water. Security framed every meeting at sea. Rendezvous points shifted by date and code to spoil submarine ambush plans. A destroyer picket, outlying guard ship, ran ahead and on the flanks with sonar and radar watching. Radio guard schedules assigned listening periods and frequencies, balanced control with silence. Short bursts passed positions and times, then sets went quiet again. Once the carriers topped off, the oilers peeled away in small groups and turned back toward Ulithi. They needed quick reloads, not long rest. Commercial tankers arrived on a regular beat to backfill the floating storage. Many were big U.S.-built types that carried about 140,000 barrels, roughly 6 million gallons. Their steady arrivals kept the lagoon's numbers from dipping into caution. Distance fixed the tempo. The fleet met oilers several hundred miles east of the Philippines, far enough to lower air risk but near enough to save time. At convoy speed, an oiler needed a day or two to reach the line, a day to pump, and a day or two to return. Bad water stretched those figures. The round trip often took 3 to 5 days, and that meant planners counted days like money. Phalalup Island stripped tide air to sea. Patrol planes, long-range search aircraft, flew sector searches from it and sent weather and sighting reports ahead of the oilers. Liaison flights, short courier flights, moved orders, mail, and urgent spares between the anchorage, the staffs, and the line. When a schedule changed, a small aircraft often carried the new time straight to a flagship's chart table. Transfers at sea remained the riskiest moments for the oil train. Destroyers sat close to the oilers during pumping and kept a tight sonar watch. They chased any contact without waiting for certainty, because a single torpedo could take down the day's plan. The screen shifted with the wind and swell, always placed to spoil a submariner's shot. Carrier decks used fueling pauses to reset the air group. Flight crews changed plugs, patched skins, and checked engines while hoses turned below. Support ships rearmed nearby but never alongside gasoline lines. Ammunition ships waited in separate areas, and carriers came to them when safe. Ordnance rose into magazines as soon as fueling ended, because tomorrow's launch needed bombs and bullets as much as gas. The rhythm hardened during the Ulithi operations in late October and November of 1944. The fast carriers struck airfields, shipping, and shore points on a tight cycle. The loop from Ulithi kept that cycle steady even as the Battle of Ulithi Gulf flared. Oilers arrived on time, pumped on time, and cleared on time. The result was simple. The schedule held and the strikes did not fade. At dawn on the 20th of November 1944, fire rose inside Ulithi Lagoon. A blast threw a column of smoke straight up and set the water burning. If fuel ships could die at anchor, the forward base was exposed. What followed showed how a floating port absorbed a hit and kept working. The fleet oiler Mississinewa, AO 59, had moored among the fuel rows overnight. A violent shock tore into her starboard side and ignited cargo tanks. A kaiten manned torpedo likely made the strike. Survivors later described a low, fast wake. Dozens died in minutes as heat and smoke swept her decks. Nearby crews acted without orders. Harbor tugs and fire boats closed, pushing foam and water through monitors. Destroyers backed clear and streamed hoses to help, while other oilers slacked lines to open a gap. Burning slicks spread downwind, but boats herded the worst with booms and broke up patches with foam. Heat drove teams back more than once. Some tug crews took lines, cut them, and tried again from another angle. A barge used as a water tender nosed into the slick and sprayed a lane so fire boats could reach the hull. Mississinewa burned, listed, and went over before noon. The fireboats kept at the floating patches until they stopped reigniting. Silence did not last. Patrol craft raced to the reef openings and set a barrier with speed and lights out. Teams with ASDIC, early Allied sonar, swept the approaches in overlapping lanes. They dropped charges on any hard return and reported bearings by short code. Divers checked the blast site for fragments and hull damage patterns that would fit a kaiten warhead. Anchorage planners redrew the fuel layout that day. Gasoline barges moved farther downwind and out of main lanes. Each barge got more anchor scope and a second mooring to keep it pointed into wind and sea. Oilers gained more spacing, and empty hulls shifted outboard to act as buffers when traffic surged. Physical barriers grew as well. Anti-submarine net barrier of steel mesh. Teams expanded spans across key passes and hung deeper baskets where currents ran strong. Net gates got stricter rules, with a guard anchored off each mouth. Gate openings followed a schedule, and port control tracked every hull in a ledger with times and positions, not just names. Night work changed shape. Crews shielded deck lights and tested angles until reflections vanished from flat water. Gasoline transfers shifted to periods with the least glow from the horizon or moon. Work parties fitted blackout curtains to winch houses and cut masthead lights to the minimum allowed. A single bright light near a fueling station became a reportable offense. Fueling drills took on a sharper edge. Hose teams practiced emergency breakaways and jettisoned lengths into the water on a whistle, then recovered them and blanked the lines fast. Deck crews staged spare gaskets and blank flanges at every manifold. Spill parties laid foam curtains on the water before valves opened and kept buckets and rags at every joint. Security drills did the same. Lookouts doubled at the reef passes and on the closest islets. Patrol patterns widened and overlapped, and reliefs came on time to keep eyes fresh. Port control rotated small craft through night stations, so engines stayed ready and radios stayed quiet. The routine kept risk low even when fatigue pressed in. Operations resumed within hours, not days. Tankers anchored on the revised plan, and pumps turned as soon as samples cleared. The lagoon accepted that it could be reached and adjusted by spreading out, hardening entrances, and reducing light. The loss hurt, but the schedule held. The next push across the map would test that new posture under a heavier load. Dawn light showed black wakes streaming in and out of Ulithi. Flight decks warmed on the horizon while oilers slid past buoys for another load. If the fuel train slipped here, the strikes ahead faltered and the tempo broke. This is where output met strategy and left a trace that lasted. By early 1945, Ulithi supported continuous strikes into the Philippines and the Ryukyus island chain between Japan and Taiwan. Carrier groups cycled in predictable beats: rendezvous, refuel, rearm, and return to the line. Destroyers refueled as often as daily during high-tempo periods, because speed and screen duty burned tanks fast. The carriers kept operating far from fixed ports without losing strike rhythm, and that fact decided schedules across whole campaigns. Turnaround times shrank from weeks to days. In 1942 and 1943, a carrier that ran low might have backtracked to Pearl Harbor or Espiritu Santo and vanished from the map for a long spell. At Ulithi in 1945, the same hull stopped for repairs alongside a tender, took stores from a refrigerated ship, and drank fuel from an oiler, often within 48 to 72 hours. That compression of time kept fast carrier task forces punching on the calendar days commanders picked, not the days supply allowed. Scale reached numbers rarely seen at sea. At its peak, the lagoon held more than 600 ships at once, The traffic of a major commercial harbor gathered inside a ring of coral. Fuel issued at Ulithi reached into the millions of barrels over months. A barrel, 42-gallon oil unit, made that total equal to tens of millions of gallons. Those figures mattered because every gallon tied to a slot in the plan. More storage, more pumps, and more disciplined transfer meant more sorties and more miles steamed. The model worked because it blended storage, repair, and resupply into one mobile system. Tankers provided floating stock and moved when threat or weather demanded. Repair ships cut long yard waits into short pierside fixes measured in shifts, not weeks. Store ships and refrigerated carriers queued close enough to serve but far enough to stay safe. Schedules integrated those flows so a destroyer topped off, swapped a pump, took rations, and sailed, all without wasting a tide. Sustained output showed in the targets the carriers reached. Strikes rolled across Luzon and the central Philippines, while the oil train kept pace toward the refueling line. As the war moved north, the same chain supported raids on the Ryukyus and the approaches to Okinawa. Bad water and enemy threat forced shifts, but the system flexed and kept windows for underway replenishment open. The result was a steady projection of air and sea power deep into enemy space. Carter understood the leverage. He called the floating base essential to sustaining the advance, and the record bears that judgment out. The system lowered risk by dispersing assets and raised speed by removing long returns to fixed ports. It also proved that mobility beat distance in the Pacific, not in a slogan but in timetables that held under pressure. Those are enduring facts in naval operations. The practice did not end with victory. Ulithi's methods carried forward into later logistics. The Navy built its post-war Combat Logistics Force, CLF, on the same principles: fuel at sea, standard couplings, predictable pump rates, and maintenance that traveled with the fleet. Fast combat support ships combined oil, ammunition, and stores under one hull to compress evolutions further. Every modern replenishment group still reflects choices refined inside that lagoon. When the war ended, the base folded fast. Oilers sailed for distant yards, repair ships unrigged, and Seabees lifted buoys and broke down pontoon piers for reuse. Paper offices closed, logs filed, and small craft dispersed to other duties. The coral ring returned to wind, water, and quiet, its vast emptiness giving back almost nothing of what it had hosted. What remained was a lesson carried in procedures and muscle memory. The lagoon's emptiness hid a system that fed an entire fleet and kept it moving. It showed how ships could assemble a port where none existed, then carry it forward as the front moved. That system turned distance from a barrier into a problem of planning, and then solved it at sea. Dark water filled the vast lagoon as tankers took station. Later, the same water lay quiet again. In between, Ulithi turned empty sea into a working fuel port, and Service Squadron 10 made distance a solvable problem. The floating gas stations kept carriers on schedule instead of tied to rear docks. Loss and adaptation after Mississinewa refined spacing, lighting, and patrols, and the schedule held. The system dispersed risk, compressed time, and moved as the front moved. Procedures, not concrete, carried the base across the map. The coral ring returned to silence, But the image remained. Hooded lights over taut hoses, pumps steady in the dark, and a fleet that could keep going.